Hi, welcome back. We are going to sort of finish up what we started with the adverse events and safety events, and we're going to talk about safety reporting. What I really want to get to you in this is sort of why safety reporting is such a big deal and why your sponsor might be really chomping at the bit to get information from you. So when you understand, it's going to be a lot of discussion about the sponsor responsibility, but you have a role in that as a clinical research coordinator because you sit with the data. So this will help you to understand perhaps why your sponsor is behaving the way they are. So let's go. So investigator has to, the investigator, so your PI has to report some things to the sponsor in the IRB. And specifically what we're looking at is a single occurrence of a serious unexpected event. So remember we talked about serious in the last lecture and unexpected. So serious being all those criteria starting all the way from death, which is a no-brainer, all the way down to an event that was, if there weren't interventions applied, would result in one of those criteria. And then unexpected, either you don't expect to see it with this drug or you don't expect to see it with the disease. So the investigator gets to be very interested in involving around reporting of an adverse event that was serious and unexpected. And it's either uncommon and also strongly associated with the study drug exposure. So not only is it uncommon and unexpected, but that your investigator believes that the study drug had a role in it. Or is not commonly associated with the study drug or the study population, so it's really out of left field. So when those things happen, and they're going to be very uncommon, knock on wood, with any luck, you should not have a lot of these, but the investigator then gets to be the originator of this event. So you'd be responsible for telling the sponsor and the IRB about the event. Now what the sponsor has to do is really big and important. And the sponsor, so you have one sponsor and one IRB. The sponsor has many investigators in many phases of development to which the sponsor is going to be interested in making aware. So the sponsor has a much greater, bigger role in communicating these kinds of events. So these are the following adverse events which will be reported by the sponsor, and there are several of them. Only one or two of them really going to come from you, but the sponsor has unique perspective on things. You only know what's happening with the participants you have at your site. The sponsor can see everything across a variety of investigators. So a single event which is uncommon and strongly associated with the study drug, and that's going to come from an investigator. A single event's always going to come from an investigator. Occurrences of an event not commonly associated with the drug, but otherwise uncommon in the population under study or the population being exposed. So this gets to be looking at a factor of not only what is the safety profile of the investigator drug under investigation, but also what happens to the study group you're looking at. So if you were doing a study with people with asthma, people with allergies, people with skin conditions, whatever it might be, understanding the pathophysiological processes is important so you'll know whether these things are uncommon. There are certain expectations that a disease will result in certain things, like for example the asthmatic is going to have respiratory distress. I think that's pretty obvious. So understanding the diseases that you're studying gets to be really important. And this is one of the reasons why you take a pathophysiology course in this class. This is going to be, when it happens at your site, there's going to be lots of discussion with the investigator about really specifically, is the event not expected in the population you're studying. The sponsor is also going to be responsible for reporting aggregate analysis. So this you cannot do at the investigative site. This involves a lot of data. So aggregate analysis, looking at a bunch of studies, which indicates that adverse events are occurring more frequently with the drug than the control group. Or if there's no control group, a historical reference group. and the sponsor is responsible for knowing this. But this is really getting to be a whole nother level of review. So the sponsor is going to look at data across all these different investigative sites and all the different phases of development that have already gone on, and sort of determine, is that adverse event more frequent? And so it's sort of the aggregate analysis, and there's going to be statisticians involved with this, is really necessary, because it's hard to sort of stand back and look and say, are those adverse events more frequent with the drug than the control group? Also, the sponsor is going to report any anticipated serious adverse event, so it's anticipated, so it's not unexpected, serious adverse event which now occurs at a rate that represents a clinically significant increase in the expected rate of occurrence. Again, you have to have statisticians to help with this, because the sponsor is saying, we have serious adverse events which happen on the study, we expect them to happen, but is the rate not only higher, but is it clinically significant over the expected rate of occurrence? And again, this is going to require a lot of analysis with the sponsor's end. And then any other adverse event or safety finding that would prompt other action by the IRB to make sure that you're protecting the rights and welfare of human subjects. So a good example of this would be if you're doing phase 1 and phase 2 studies, your sponsor might still be concluding some of their animal studies, especially in the phase 1 studies. And so it's not uncommon for your sponsor to say, oh, stop, we need to let you know that there's something really interesting in terms of safety findings from the animal studies. So that would be an important finding to pass on to the IRB. The IRB might say your study is no longer safe, it's no longer scientifically valid, you might require all sorts of activities such as amending the protocol, changing the consent form, and things like that. But this is sort of a large catch-all kind of thing that you would do, that the sponsor would do, to make sure that you're maintaining the rights and welfare of your participants. So how do the sponsors report what they find? You know how you're going to report it. You're going to call your sponsor. Your sponsor is already going to give you instructions on how to do it, and your IRB will give you instructions on how specifically to report events to them. But how does the sponsor then, in turn, report what they know? There's something called the Ind Safety Report. We've discussed it before. It used to be called the Dear Doctor letter, but the Ind Safety Report is in Part 312. It's submitted to the FDA and to all the investigators. This could be a lot of people. The FDA is not so much, but for like a phase 3 study, that Ind Safety Report's not going to go just to the investigators on that phase 3 study. It's going to go to every investigator that is participating in a trial with that investigational drug, regardless of what phase, and it might be a different study, but all the active clinical trials with that drug will get the Ind Safety Report. It's expected that the sponsor is going to send the Ind Safety Report to the FDA and all the investigators no later than 15 calendar days. Now notice this doesn't say business days, so if it's Labor Day weekend, it doesn't matter to the FDA, it's calendar days. After the starting of the time the sponsor determines that this has to be reported. So 15 calendar days is not very long. Knowing this will help you to understand and prioritize your work as a research coordinator. So you'll know that this sort of is going to become a priority for you. Now, just a note to sort of calm any anxiety you have. Sometimes these Ind Safety Reports, and not sometimes, very frequently, these Ind Safety Reports will be incomplete. So you might have an unexpected, suspected adverse event or adverse reaction that is still ongoing. So it hasn't resolved, and there's still lots of questions going on. You have to submit an initial report. You might amend that report later as more information becomes known, and eventually you will do a final follow-up report. But you can't wait for the whole event to conclude and be all wrapped up nice and neat with a bow. So you at least have to let the sponsor know right away, because the sponsor has just those 15 calendar days to let the FDA and everybody know what's going on. It gets a lot tighter. The time frame shrinks by a little more than half. No later than 7 calendar days for unexpected, fatal, or life-threatening suspected adverse reactions. So now you have a very, very short timeline. And so this is really the reason why 15 calendar days is sort of, for a lot of events, is enough time to resolve it and to have a full report. 7 calendar days is typically not enough time to totally answer all the questions that will surround an unexpected, fatal, or life-threatening event. So you're going to at least submit an initial report. The sponsor is going to turn around and say to the FDA and every investigator, this is what's going on. The investigator brochure is the other route by which sponsors will let everybody know what's going on. The investigator brochure is much less frenetic and hectic, and it is done annually. So there is a month in which an investigator brochure is initially published, if you will, and then it gets updated annually at that month. And then it gets submitted to all the investigators annually. You in turn will submit that to your IRB. Now, the investigator brochure, so the 7 and 15 calendar days are going to make you sort of sit up and notice, and going to sort of take up some of your time to make sure that you're very timely on your end. The investigator brochure is supposed to be an accounting for all the adverse events that have happened, all of them, whether they were unexpected, whether they were adverse reactions, whether they were fatal, life-threatening, every adverse event that happened with that investigational drug for the entire year will be produced and published in this investigator brochure. By the way, people usually call it the IB. So when you hear people talking about the IB, they're talking about the investigator brochure. So what happens usually is you will find a very large push from your sponsor to get as much data submitted to them as possible. And you're going to think to yourself, well, I don't have anything that's going to result in an IND safety report. Why is their hair on fire? It's because your sponsor is trying to get as much information into that investigator brochure to have it be as robust and as detailed as possible. So they are going to push you sometimes to get data submitted early. And that's why, so they can send it out to everybody annually, and you'll get one every year. Now, the code of federal regulations allows the sponsors to submit subsections more frequently. So, if it's a study with a lot of adverse events, you might find that some of the safety sections are going to be submitted more frequently. And anytime you get one, you will turn around and submit it to your IRB. Also, the investigator brochure, if things change in what is understood about the drug, that will also change the consent form. So this is going to have some downstream effects for you. But there's really two methods here. The IND safety report for things that are very important, serious, attention-grabbing events to the FDA and all investigators, and then that investigator brochure that's just done annually to make sure everybody's aware of what's going on. So of course, my reference is the Code of Federal Regulations, you can't go wrong, and then the most recent U.S. Food and Drug Administration guidance here for adverse event reporting. So, you know I love your questions. I'd be happy to talk to you, answer your email, whatever works best for you. So please let me know if any of this didn't make sense or if you need clarifications, and otherwise I will talk to you soon. Take care.